Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just take a couple of extra minutes until we receive a few more participants in today's session. We have received a significant number of registrations, but we're still only recording a small number of participants. So please bear with us while we give people extra time to join us. Thank you. Hi, everyone. We're just giving people till 12:32 to join us. So if you can hold on for another minute, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Okay, well, it is 12:32 and we do expect a few more people to join us, but I realise that we've all got a lot on today, especially on International Women's Day. So thank you all for joining us. My name is Jill McCabe. I'm the CEO of Professionals Australia. Before we start today's session, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, right across the country, and I wish to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend my respect to all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including those who may be joining us today. I also want to highlight that Professionals Australia is supporting the Yes campaign for a First Nations voice to Parliament. So if you're a PA member and you want to get involved, there are plenty of ways that you can do that. And Mandy Gervin, who is co-hosting today, will be able to provide some details to you later in this session. Welcome to our briefing today on how the recent IR reforms that were introduced through the Secure Jobs and Better Pay legislation last year are designed to improve gender equality and the experience of women in their working lives. Today, Professionals Australia released a report about the impending skills crisis in our engineering sector. And one of the most startling findings was that the lack of female representation in the engineering sector is actually one of the major causes for the skills gap, and will actually undermine all of the infrastructure projects, the transition to green energy and technological innovation that we're planning into the future. And the gap isn't surprising when we look at the pay and conditions facing not just women in engineering, but women in STEM more broadly. You would have seen our previous publications on the issues facing women working in STEM, serious lack of equal pay, so a significant gender pay gap, lack of flexible working hours, affordable childcare, lack of access to career development and advancement opportunities, significant discrimination, and sexual stereotyping, as well as harassment. So there are a whole range of issues that coalesce to cause women not to enter these professions, but even when they enter those professions, then to reconsider their future and potentially leave these very important sectors to our economy. So while addressing gender equality at work will require a multifaceted approach, and that means in the education sector, with government policy, at the industry and workplace level, the recent IR reforms will play a vital role in helping to improve employment opportunities and outcomes for women. And today we're very fortunate to have Margaret Buchanan, who's the Director of Industrial Strategy and Workplace Advice and Support at Professionals Australia, to talk to us about what the specific reforms are that are designed to not only promote gender equality, but to achieve that. So I'd like to welcome Margaret to the panel and to kick off the discussion today about how the reforms can be used to better outcomes for women at work. Thank you, Margaret.
Thanks very much, Jill. What I'm about to do is just put up some slides for us. That should now be present. You'll see that the focus I've decided to take is really on how we can use these changes to improve gender equality. So rather than simply look at those provisions that are now in place that provide for certain things, such as there are flexible work arrangements that if you come within one of the categories, which can include, for example, you're over 55 or over, you're got childcare responsibilities, etc., that you can seek flexible work, and there's a process that's been established for that. We'll have a separate session on that specifically, because that's obviously one of wide interest. What we would suggest with that, and this will become more apparent as we start working through the presentation today, is that there are ways to broaden some of these provisions via enterprise or multi-employer bargaining. And that's certainly worth encouraging, so that it's not just the minimum requirements that are provided under the Act. The other major change, which we're not going into a great extent, although its obvious relevance to ensuring gender equality, is around family and domestic violence leave. So there's now 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave. You don't need an agreement for that. It's provided for under the legislation. It is available to anyone now that needs it. And I think what our focus needs to be there is ensuring that employers are implementing that in a way that maintains confidentiality and obviously empathy and understanding of the requirements for anyone that needs to leave a situation of family or domestic violence. But coming to what our focus of today is, it's important to recognise that the legislation itself brings forward some institutional changes in how this is looked at. So any matter that comes before the Commission there is now a specific recognition that gender equality is an object of the Act. So whether that's individual-oriented matters or collective matters, that is an object of the Act, along with the establishment of an expert panel on gender pay equity. And these will both assist efforts by unions and members to make improvements in this area. So I'm going to start off with sexual harassment. I think it's a key one. It's one that puts people in very vulnerable positions. And that's why it's important that one of the changes, in fact, through the Secure Jobs Better Pay legislation, is to establish a positive duty on employers and PCBUs, which stands for persons conducting businesses and undertakings, to prevent sexual harassment. And there's a number of ways that we can be directly involved in encouraging this. So, for example, the first dot point there about unions being directly involved in the induction of new employees and any annual training and refreshers on prevention of sexual harassment, options for reporting and support and so on. I see this as really quite a vital one in a lot of workplaces. It's important that it's not just seen as an employer-driven agenda, that this is about gender equality within a workplace. And to that extent, sometimes unions are better placed than employers in explaining what is sexual harassment and in establishing norms around this. We are seeing that particularly in some traditionally male blue-collar areas, Western Australia's mining industry is an example, where unions are being directly involved in playing a part in the education around what is sexual harassment. And speaking to some officials, for example, of the Electrical Trades Union, where they have around 10% of their membership is women, they'd like to get more women into their industry. There's issues for them because of the trade form of training is less popular than going to university for women. And they see their role as very much needing to be at the forefront of encouraging women's participation and playing a role in creating a workplace environment in which that is supported and positive. So this particular area is one that unions could be directly involved. And similarly, involvement in identifying third-party risks. So you would have seen there's been quite a few ads around lately around it's not on abuse, for example, of those who are in customer service roles. A similar role could be played with clients and work environments, not having unsafe work environments, late at night, in isolated areas, that kind of thing, identifying these sorts of issues. And this brings me to, I guess, one way that members could consider being involved more directly, and that is being as health and safety representatives in your workplace. There is a poll question here, thank you, which is just asking everyone that's on today whether or not you have health and safety representatives at your workplace. And if you could select one of those, yes, no, unsure, so that we can see what people's understanding is and what the prevalence of HSRs are as well, just from our group today. Thank you. That's very interesting. So we have got a majority that have got health and safety representatives at your workplace. That's very positive. I guess the other question is, to what extent do those health and safety representatives represent professional workers in the workplace, or others? But the important thing is that we are seeing, so sexual harassment can come within health and safety requirements, and as a positive duty that's being even more reinforced. And it can fit into one of the, potential psychosocial hazards in a workplace. So increasingly health and safety is becoming an area of acute interest, I would suggest, to those who work as professionals. When we start looking at workloads, working hours, when these are becoming excessive, they also are health and safety risks. So sexual harassment is one among a number of issues that in the workplace create potential safety hazards. And sexual harassment is more than a potential safety hazard. It is a safety hazard. It obviously impacts on someone's ability to engage at work at all. So that is definitely an area that could be explored. And if you don't know, I'd suggest if you don't know who your health and safety representative is to ask at your workplace, are there health and safety representatives? If you do know that there are health and safety representatives, go and introduce yourself to them and indicate your interest in seeing that sexual harassment and other issues of concern to yours are understood by that person, that you support efforts to prevent these safety hazards. And similarly, I guess the next step to consider is whether to be, in fact, to choose to be trained as a health and safety representative and understand what rights you do have to take steps and actions in a workplace so that safety is maintained. Later this year as well, the Australian Human Rights Commission will have the ability to look at investigations that have been triggered by unions and or delegates into a workplace around sexual harassment. This is a really major change because it doesn't involve the need for a complainant. We're still not completely sure how the Australian Human Rights Commission will structure this. It is something that is coming to play later this year. Related to this, I guess, is to sort of understand generally how complaints, whether it's sexual harassment or discrimination, are generally treated, which is very much on the individual level rather than the collective level. And so kind of moving into discrimination generally, another part of the changes are the establishment of new grounds that are prohibited for discrimination, being breastfeeding, gender identity, and intersex status. This means that these are now grounds that are protected from, an individual is protected from having their employment terminated or otherwise being treated adversely because they have one of those attributes. Obviously, there is already a huge range of other attributes that are prohibited from discrimination, such as race, age, sex, disability, and the avenues for the redress in relation to those remain in place. Mainly, that is, unfair dismissal or reinstatement or damages or compensation being the main ways in which redress is offered when that occurs under the Fair Work Act. Discrimination, of course, does have other legislation, and that can be pursued. And that often it's become a fairly complex area for individuals. It's also quite a fraught area for individuals to be bringing this. So while it's positive that there are new identified grounds for discrimination. One of the things I would suggest we need to do as unions and as members is think about, well, that's all very well. We're creating more potential areas that are covered, but how do we get around one of the essential issues, which is that it comes down of falling on the individual to be able, both mentally, connected as well enough to be able to seek advice and pursue those claims. How else can we address this, which has been a kind of long-standing concern in this area? So that's where we start to look at how discrimination might be addressed on a collective level. And currently we have it so that industrial awards and agreements cannot discriminate on any of the prohibited grounds. What's new is that awards and agreements especially can contain special measures. Now, what is a special measure? And that is a provision that is aimed at achieving equality, and we'll go into this a little bit more. But it must be necessary and intended to achieve substantial equality. And new provisions which permit special measures in industrial agreements are available via collective bargaining. So I just wanted to get a sense from the group again today, how many of you have been involved in bargaining for an enterprise agreement in your workplace? Thanks. Oh, that's more than I would have expected. That's a pretty good percentage there. Okay. I guess a more follow-up questions would be how many of you have agreements in your workplace? Because the next part of our session really starts to dive into, well, what can we be doing with agreements? Agreements are the gold standard for establishing entitlements, other than what we can get into awards and legislation, of course. Another option for those workplaces that do not have agreements, I guess, is to look at policies and what might go into policies around that, and whether or not that might be something that you'd like to work with your union to have established in your workplace if they don't have an agreement, for example. But where there is an agreement, what we don't want to do is see these things end up in policies. It's far better if they're in agreements, because that means they're enforceable, and that means that there's ways of making sure they don't just disappear over time. Now, some examples of special measures, although when I say special measures here, I'm not really talking about that definition that's come into the Act. That's still to be really worked out, what that will mean. For example, with the clause around breastfeeding that provides for paid time off and suitable facilities at the workplace, we already see clauses like that in some agreements. That's not new. But that is something that could be considered in putting forward in an agreement. Similarly with gender identity, I think we're starting to see policies that are starting to provide for paid leave for transition and affirmation purposes. But when we start to think about, well, what might be special measures, that's where we might, for example, want to look at the gender pay gap, which has been much in the media over the last week or two, where it still is, I think we still look at every industry, and in every industry, the gender pay gap exists. And when it comes to agreements and what special measures we might look at there, there are some agreements, for example, that only specify minimum rates of pay. We don't really know, therefore, what employees on the same classification may in fact be earning, particularly if the bands, there is not even a band, it's just a minimum rate of pay and there's no band specified. Even if there is a band, if that band is worth 10 or 15,000, then there could be a significant gap in that workplace, even though there is a collective agreement in place that may in fact not be assisting with the gender pay gap. Because one of the things that we do know, and this is where the pay secrecy provisions, which we talked about recently in another briefing, are quite significant, is the transparency around pay is crucial in helping to reduce the gender pay gap. Where legislation is introduced around pay secrecy, we've seen drops in the gender pay gap. One of the vital roles that collective agreements potentially play. That's purely on the assumption, of course, that people are doing the same job for the same pay. That's that concept. The gender pay gap is broader than that, of course. It can be, well, if you're looking at across an industry, what is the gender pay gap? It doesn't necessarily take into account the different types of work that people are doing. It's just looking at what is happening. And similarly in a workplace, so are women tending to be at one end of the spectrum compared to men and so on. So one of the things that is certainly worth considering when we're looking at workplaces or industries is, well, do we want to do a gender pay audit in that workplace? Is that something that as a union we want to support? Is that something that members want to see as well? Then we get into, and this is going off, it's kind of related to the gender pay gap, but doesn't have to be, is in the controversial area of targets and quotas. Now, I've spoken to a lot of members over the years where when this is introduced by the employer, it's often seen as by both women and men in the workplace as, well, what are they doing? Why are they doing this? Are they just trying to do this to tick some box? That there's a sense that it's not really that genuine about creating gender equality in the workplace, and that there's still concerns about how that's done. So I guess the thing that I think is we need to start to think about is, well, in what circumstances would we propose as a union that it is acceptable or not, or needed or not, I think would be the question. And that relates to this whole question around affirmative action.
Excuse me, Margaret. We've just got a question that is related to the gender pay gap, and it's come from Dom, and I'm sure Dom wouldn't mind us calling him out here, but he's asked a really good question about how do you ensure that pay equity programs in organisations actually do result in real increases rather than a wage suppression strategy. So here Dom's talking about you hold down the wages of existing staff and professionals until parity is achieved by some undefined future state or future date. So I think that that's possibly where we could start to look at the gender pay audit as a way of actually being able to ascertain what is really going on in organisations. And I know we've heard recently of new staff joining organisations at considerably higher rates of pay than existing, and that issue of obviously pay secrecy comes into play here. But any further comments on whether the gender pay audit would help in those sort of situations?
I think you're right, and Dom's on the money there about like we're hearing these days about greenwashing, whitewashing by corporates, and also I think pinkwashing by corporates. And it's another example potentially is that they will meet the new requirements around the Gender Pay Equity Agency and their reporting, but what we're not seeing necessarily is that salaries are being uplifted, but that there is in fact, as Dom's accurately described it, a wage suppression. So to that extent, that's where I I think there is room here for unions to take a strong position on gender equality, but not at the cost of overall worker interests here in seeing wages be maintained and not be either lowered from what they were 10 years ago. Like we're seeing this a lot in professional roles in particular, and particularly in the public sector as well, where jobs are just not what they were worth 10 years ago. And that's because of a whole series of wage suppression tactics, not least this potentially being one as well. So that leads me to this concept of equality bargaining that I wanted to sort of put to the group today, which is something that's quite common across Europe, that's much more familiar with multi-employer bargaining than we have traditionally been. And what it involves is a deliberate effort to include those groups that are traditionally marginalised, and that could be both, women, could be youth as well. It could be those from a migrant background, to be directly involved in the bargaining or the developing of logs of claims. So as someone that has worked as a negotiator, it's quite helpful to have your group of delegates that are there to sort of advise about, well, what's going on in this workplace. But what I would see equality bargaining involving as well is that group is in a sense has also got input either from the workplace level or from an industry or national level, a group that have sort of turned their minds to, well, what are the issues occurring in this type of work, this industry, this sector, that we need to address, because we see this as perpetuating a certain types of inequalities, which may include gender inequality, that would be really assist in shifting this and having that ability to provide that kind of advice. So that's where that I'm talking about. So how do we deal with, for example, childcare demands? And particularly in some of our engineering areas, there's been, incredible support from the male members to have access to parental leave so they can perform their part in being involved in particularly young children, being involved in providing their support with young children. Now, we are seeing parental leave, paid parental leave being extended to dads, but it's been quite slow. And yet when we talk about the gender pay gap, one of the biggest contributors to it is the fact that women are taking time out of the workplace to raise kids. So if that is more shared, we will see less of a inequality issue there, for example. I don't know if there's any comments that are coming through the chat around this, Jill, but it would be interesting to know what other sorts of things members have encountered themselves that they feel have, goes against a kind of gender equality approach.
Yeah, we've had a few questions here. So again, just going back to some of the special measures, it's really around, one of the questions was, so much of engineering is out on the field, a long way from site offices. How much is actually being done to ensure local work site facilities are being provided? So in this day and age, it still shocks me that they're not, but that's obviously an important special measure. It shouldn't be special, it should just be standard. But has there been any efforts in that area? And then
I might just jump in with that one, Jill, because that was one of the specific ones that the ETU, for example, are looking at, is that we need to have, facilities for everybody out on site, not just have facilities that are for one gender available.
So again, that would be something that we'd want to be looking at in terms of bargaining and making sure that equality was factored into our claims and outcomes there. I think that there's some really, oh, hang on, I'm trying to now see the questions and I can't see them. Oh, here we go. I can see them now, which is fantastic. Just looking here at just one of the comments, which was around even when remuneration is specified in workplaces, that people can be classified at a higher level. So often in the tens of thousands of dollars per year. So that again is that masking of what people are really earning, which is problematic. And again, I think that pay equity audit would be really important to uncover what was happening right across an organisation. How easy is it to get that pay equity audit done, Margaret, under the legislation? Is it just encouraged, or is it's a requirement?
No, so this would depend very much on us being able to gain this through bargaining, through collective bargaining, and getting it established into agreements. I don't think we would have strong prospects of getting it into an award, for example, unless we were able to show that we already knew that there were major problems in a particular sector or industry. So, for example, possibly the finance sector union, which has operates in a sector in which there's one of the largest gender pay gaps of any, might be able to argue it for their awards, that they need to have that as a special measure, as a requirement for a period of time until substantive equality had been achieved. What that all means, though, might be just to bring it in line with other sectors and industries, rather than that they've gone further than other industries in addressing that gender pay gap, for example. I don't know enough about their industry to really put that forward strongly, but just as an example. So it really comes to more about what we can be looking at in terms of multi-employer bargaining that is on the horizon. It doesn't really, the legislation for this doesn't come into effect until mid this year. And as some members would be aware, we're starting to look at, well, where might we look at this? And there's a number of approaches unions could take to this. It's quite challenging, because often you're either looking at trying to bundle up existing workplaces that have got agreements, and that creates its challenges, or you're trying to create agreements in workplaces that traditionally don't have agreements, which means unless you can show that it comes within a demonstrated need for additional support that the supported bargaining provides, you simply got to show that a majority support it. And that creates all sorts of challenges, because as unions, we don't have the lists of employees to contact to even be able to ask if they would like to be. We rely entirely on our members to get that kind of information. And that's needs to be done in a very careful way, so that it doesn't expose members to, questions about whether or not they're releasing information that's meant to be kept confidential. But one of the things that we will be doing is, as unions, is working together in industries and sectors and looking at, at least for some, in sectors where traditionally we haven't had agreements, or maybe only one or two with particular employers. And it does raise the question of, when we're going out and talking about all of this, of course, people are interested in getting a pay rise, but does some of this equality bargaining focus also lend itself to, in a sense, explaining, well, what do unions stand for when it comes to gender equality, but also other forms of equality, and what our values are, and the involvement of diverse workforces that may not have traditionally had any association with unions, or it's some time since they have, and that's been lost. And in a sense, we've got to re-establish ourselves. So this is an area that if we're wanting to relate to what people's needs are, I suggest that we need to be very focused on, well, what are the diverse needs of people, bearing in mind that we've all got attributes of different sorts that create needs and desires, and that may be very consistent with an inclination to work collectively with others. Nonetheless, it doesn't just make us individuals. It can, in fact, make us sort of wanting to work together as a group to make sure everybody is being looked after and being treated well and with respect.
Margaret, we do have a couple of other questions that I think really deal with some of the other changes to definitions of the other traits for anti-discrimination.
Okay.
Question, and then the next sort of the follow-on from that was around due to the incredibly small number of female engineers. One female engineer makes a huge difference. And there's a question then about non-binary engineers who may currently be registered as female and want to have their details changed and updated, and this would no longer count towards gender diversity. So concerns about how employers might treat that as well.
That's a really interesting point, because I think increasingly there is a recognition that people identify in different ways, and that that in a sense that needs to be reflected in that what is currently a very binary sort of definitional issue around men and women. That's something that would really lend itself, I think, to a collective agreement sort of provision that acknowledged that there were all genders, and also people that have, chosen what their gender will be, to be reflected in that way. Now, how that's done, that's a perfect example of where it would be much better to be getting advice from those who would like that to happen than someone that is a negotiator but doesn't have personal experience or a lot of direct knowledge of what is a good way of doing that. So that's a really good example, I think, where having a reference group, for example, we could develop some measures that would reflect that better.
So again, Margaret, looking at the special measures that could be taken in our approach to enterprise bargaining, and certainly, absolutely having a focus on identity, and as well as, and I think someone else has also talked about neurodiversity, some of the issues that really are impacting on our members, regardless of the way that they identify. We actually need to make sure we're encompassing all of those concerns. There was another question in here, which was about domestic violence and access to domestic violence leave, Margaret, and whether the legislation puts pretty tight limitations around who can access the leave. So how broad is it? Is it that anyone who experiences a form of domestic or family violence, regardless of the family member or how you define family, are they eligible for that leave, or is it much more tightly defined in terms of it has to be a partner if we got any guidance around those provisions.
So it can include, for example, siblings, and it's not defined narrowly to whether they are stepbrothers or sisters or adopted brothers or sisters, for example. It is defined as immediate family, and a number of different relatives are mentioned, but it certainly goes beyond partner. And similarly, it can be, within the household as well in which you're living. And in terms of providing support to someone, then that will relate to as well a fairly broad definition. So it is fairly broad. What will be interesting, because it's now paid and it's across the board, is whether there is any challenges that occur around, well, for example, does an adopted sister that you didn't grow up with count? We'll have to see. I would like to think that the nature of family domestic violence is that it's through, it doesn't matter who you grew up with necessarily. It is the nature of that kinship and so on that has provided the connection and has provided the particularly, I guess, troubling and damaging effects of when that occurs.
Thanks, Margaret. And just another one on, we're talking about collective bargaining and the opportunities that will create for us. One of our participants has talked about the fact that there is, in fact, a push in their organisation to move professionals away from the enterprise agreements and onto individual contracts. So is there anything in these reforms that would help us to prevent that from happening?
Well, I think that's a good point, and that relates to this broader question of if we're looking at extending collective bargaining to industries and sectors that traditionally haven't had it, and recognising that there is a value in an employee-based organisation such as a union playing an active role in all of this, then not excluding groups such as professionals ideally would be a good step and to be encouraged, I would have thought. So I think it does help in that that issue around the legitimacy of unions and what we bring to making workplaces safe places, productive places, and etc. to work in.
Thanks, Margaret.
The last question I wanted to sort of, again, just sort of put forward as a poll was to see whether anyone would consider being involved in an industry or sector working group of members to help develop equality bargaining measures. And look, this is just a bit of a poll just to get a bit of a sense of, is this something that this group, who obviously have come along today, you have an interest in this area, thank you. Realise you may not be representative of the whole union in this sense, but just to get a sense of, well, is there a level of interest at all amongst our members around doing something like this? And just to be clear, there is a question that's gone up. Thank you. Oh, that's fabulous. Oh, really good. Thank you. That's really encouraging. Great result. Well, I think that might be something that we want to look at following up, Jill, as we head towards looking at multi-employer bargaining in particular. But it's got a value whether or not we're doing enterprise agreements, for example, or multi-employer bargaining, is to have those insights, such as the gender identity issue that was raised before, is like, what's a good way to deal with that? What's the recommendation that this group might, for example, put forward about that? So that's something I certainly would be interested in following up with interested people following this session today. There is also other ways that you might like to suggest that we look at gender equality and pursuing. And today has had very much a collective bargaining focus as a way of pursuing it, apart from the health and safety rep approach. But is there any other way that anyone would like to pop into the chat?
And there is another question here around, again, workplaces with these rules around 50% female, 50% male in terms of, I know that's in terms of perhaps panels and interviewing, and the issue of, you know, how this actually sits against the fact that we will have intersex and non-binary people wanting to apply for jobs and also be involved in those panels and all of that other decision making. So questions around how do we address some of those inherent biases, even though the HR teams are always saying we're not going to discriminate, but systematically in a workplace, those policies and those practices are discriminatory.
Yeah, I mean, look, just pulling up those questions again and seeing the question about neurodiversity, that's a real sleeper. It's one that's been coming from our STEM membership for some years now, not surprisingly. But I think one of the, like with anything of this nature, it's important to give the experience a voice. And that then helps to develop greater understanding in the workplace. So your HR areas are not going to be experts on at all on most of these things. Their job is to kind of attempt to maintain a harmonious workplace without ideally jumping into anything, I think is their general approach. But it is a way that things, you know, can become the fad of the moment and they get some attention. I think neurodiversity presents real challenges in workplaces because fundamentally you want to create workplaces that respect all, and we have certain ways of showing respect. And I think there would be really interesting to and again, it might be something that as a union we're particularly well placed to do, is to talk about, well, what does neurodiversity look like and what does respect look like in a neurodiverse workplace? And again, these are kind of questions that we're probably very well suited to explore and have something to say about and contribute to that kind of greater understanding, which seems to be the floor that we work from, the platform that we work from to create more greater equality in work relationships and other relationships.
Thanks, Margaret. And there is another question here, and it does go to the non-disclosure agreements, Margaret, that so many people, when they've been treated unfairly, they may have been discriminated against, and there's a settlement that's reached, and then there's a non-disclosure agreement that you sign. And yet the issues that you faced in that situation are not being able to be discussed with anyone. So any efforts there to try and change the provisions around, if you are subjected to harassment and discrimination and you do get a settlement, any possibility that those provisions around non-disclosure agreements may be lifted?
It's been very positive to read that the ACT government is looking at non-disclosure agreements, and similarly changes are happening overseas. So we are seeing a movement, I think, and a trend that the non-disclosure aspects of these agreements can be very damaging to the individual. We've all heard, I think, stories of people that have been through sexual harassment claims, for example, and processes, and have then signed agreements that have seemed to prevent them from even talking to psychologists and other similar support people about their experiences. So, but even if it doesn't have that kind of limitation on it, but is about just not in any sense talking about it in a more public way, I think there is again a trend away from this kind of hiding of things is not in the public interest, that it is important that we can move away from that. And there is also, someone said to me recently, well, if you're an employer and you can't have a non-disclosure requirement, why would you agree to it? And I think with, for example, the positive duty around the sexual harassment matter, that changes things, because your duty is to, to, in a sense, prevent and to address when it does occur, not to hide it away, not to pretend it didn't happen. And so to that extent, I think with the sexual harassment side of things, we may see an increasing push around, well, what does that positive duty mean? And that would be something that we could definitely use. But it isn't limited, is it, to sexual harassment issues where non-disclosure agreements are required. But I think if the general sort of understanding of these things seem to do more harm than good to the individual, that once that is well and truly understood, then corporates that wish to be seen as treating their employees well will be amongst those to start moving away from that, and that then helps to create that general trend. So I do feel optimistic about that. I also feel optimistic on the, while we're talking about, employers' ways of gagging and limiting employees, that we're also seeing, and this is totally off topic, but it is, I think, important, is this restraint of trade. The fact that the Albanese government is looking at, has referred that to the ACCC to look at, well, about restraint of trade clauses in contracts, is another really positive development from a perspective of workers' rights. So yeah, quick mention of that, back on topic. Let's hope we do see an accelerated move towards the end of non-disclosure agreements.
Thanks,
One of the things that is being pushed hard in the new sexual harassment jurisdiction is that the standard settlement agreement that's used by the Commission will not include a non-disclosure requirement. Yeah, so that's also
step, yeah,
another thing to help along that way.
Excellent.
But really good question, because it's this kind of silencing that is quite damaging.
Indeed. All right. Well, look, thank you so much, Margaret, for your time today, and also to all of our participants. Really value your time and your input and your questions. We'll go back and just make sure that we've responded to all of the questions today. If not, we'll make sure we do a follow-up with you. The recording will be available to you as well. So we'll send that out or make it available to our members who are here with us today. And we look forward to representing you in the future and hopefully achieving much greater equality for our members, no matter who they are or where they work. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.